Hello, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So welcome back to my channel. So this is a grave hour for world peace, particularly in Eastern Europe, because today is the day that some people think that Russia is going to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Of course, Russia's been invading Ukraine for 8 years. And how can you possibly trust the Russian government when they lie and lie and lie about that every single day, about their soldiers being in Donbass and Luhansk, about the fact that Crimea is Ukrainian sovereign territory, which even Russia acknowledged until 2014, and treats the United Nations as completely irrelevant to this, claims that the Ukrainian conflict is an internal conflict, and yet then demands to have a say in this, signs peace accords, the Minsk agreement about Ukraine. And if it is internal, why on earth should Russia opine on it? And why on earth would Russia sign a peace agreement if it weren't a party to the conflict? So the illogicality of their position is blatant. I'm not being remotely Russophobic. Russian people are not bad people. No nation is bad like no nation is good. There's good and bad individuals, and good and bad in each individual. So there are aspects of Russian culture to admire, and Russia has many accomplishments to its name. And not to say that every Ukrainian involved in this conflict is innocent either. But the simple truth is that Ukraine has invaded Russia, and now the Russian government is providing the pretext for their possible invasion, or probable invasion, I should say. So their ambassador to the European Union is Vladimir Chizhov, and it's 2 days ago. He said that we shan't attack Ukraine unless we're provoked. Unless they attack Russia or start blatantly killing Russian citizens in Donbass or elsewhere. And that's the end of the quotation. Now, this is exactly what British intelligence and American intelligence have been saying for about a month that Russia would do: a false flag incident, make it look like some Russians in Ukraine were killed, or indeed actually kill Russians themselves in Ukraine, and then say, you see that, it's a massacre, we have to intervene. Just last month, Putin said what's going on there looks like genocide, which is an outrageous lie. About 14,000 people have been killed in this conflict, inevitably some of those civilians. If you shell military positions in a city, some of those shells are going to go astray and kill civilians. There might be soldiers and civilians in a building, the building gets blown up, they both get killed. So far as I know, neither side has deliberately killed civilians. Maybe I'm mistaken, but if you have tens of thousands of troops on either side, you're going to get a few psychopaths. Someone whose relative was accidentally killed might choose to seek vengeance and deliberately kill a civilian on the other side, which is still an evil thing to do. And both sides could be guilty of this, I don't know, but there's nothing been remotely approaching genocide. The only large-scale slaying of civilians was when that Malaysia Airlines was shot down several years ago by the pro-Russian rebels. I should call them terrorists, really, because if you're fighting illegally, then that is terrorism. Let's take the Terrorism Act, which is unlawful violence in furtherance of any national, religious, or other ideological cause in any part of the world. If Russia were to declare war on Ukraine, well, that would be different. A Russian soldier who killed a Ukrainian soldier in battle wouldn't be a bad person, or who accidentally killed civilians wouldn't be a bad person. But if you're fighting illegally, that's different. So anyway, so they've already said what their excuse is going to be, and they're moronic enough to actually go along with precisely what the United States and the UK said the Russians will do. Of course, they got previous on this when Putin was Prime Minister of Russia back in 1999. Those notorious apartment block bombings, several apartment blocks in Russia were blown up, hundreds of Russian civilians were murdered by their own government, and it all came out in the wash. How FSB, that's Russian internal intelligence agents that were arrested, showed their FSB identity cards were released, having placed bombs in the basement of an apartment block, which was then defused, and the Russian government couldn't get its story straight, said, yeah, the terrorist operation was foiled. No, it wasn't, it was a security drill, but you're not allowed to do that. You have to warn the public, you can't just surprise them, claim it was sacks of sugar, and always contradicting themselves. And Russia had a fairly free media at the time, and in chat shows it came out, people say, no, this is ridiculous, this was not this is not a military drill at all. And some of those who were witnesses saying, no, this was the state trying to kill people, they were disappeared or killed themselves in the next few years. or they'd even announced an apartment block had been blown up in a certain city. They announced that in the Russian parliament, but no apartment block had been blown up in that city. Nevertheless, they went ahead and blew one up a few days later. So this is exactly the kind of thing they're going to do. So Putin would be very willing to kill his own people in order to start a completely unnecessary war of aggression. So it's very worrying. And the Russian troops on this huge military exercise in Belarus, and they could attack Kiev, because of course Belarus is actually quite close to Kiev. There are even Russian troops in Moldova. Could those come into play? There are not very many of them, there's several thousand, but Ukraine could be assailed on all four sides. Well, I'm very glad I'm not Ukrainian. I do feel very sorry for them, and my heart goes out to them. And of course, most Russians are not in favour of this. Only about 28% of Russians want to go to war with Ukraine. I mean, they're already at war with Ukraine, but a full-scale war. Now, once full-scale fighting actually starts, I think that there'll be an uptick in that. If it's coordinated at the top, I've interviewed by the KGB over the couple of days. The Bolsheviks never die, they go to hell and work from there. We are, well, indeed, sadly, it's straight from the KGB playbook. Thank you, Janine. So it is very troubling, and probably millions of Ukrainian refugees are going to come to the European Union. The Europeans not really got ready for them, because it would suggest they think war is inevitable and might even encourage even more people to flee. So Russia will probably be quite successful in the initial stages, but what if there's a protracted conflict? What if there's partisan activity? They might find that more difficult. They're trying to avoid fighting in cities. I hope the Ukrainians have taken necessary preparatory measures. But just today, the Russian parliament voted they're going to suggest to the president that Luhansk and Donbass be recognized as a Russian sovereign territory. As independent republics. And that may well be preparatory towards their absorption within the Russian Federation. So there's another very hostile act, trying to steal another country's land like that. I know Russia's not the only country in history that's done it, and my country has done that sometimes too. Okay, but it's not doing it now, and it shouldn't be done, especially when we have all these international agreements not to do that kind of thing, which we didn't have centuries ago. We have the United Nations, you have a dispute with another sovereign state, you work through those mechanisms of the International Court of Justice and so on, and if you don't get your way, well, you have to accept it, because that's how international law and world peace works. So anyway, yeah, and then the Kremlin said, oh, this claim that we're going to stage a false flag incident in Ukraine, you've provided no evidence. Well, of course you haven't. I mean, it hasn't happened yet. Plus, presumably, the British and Americans, they've got double agents inside Russia. And no, they're not going to expose their spies and say who told them and how exactly this information was garnered. So it's all very worrying indeed. So the Russian government is that imbecilic to go along with exactly what the Americans and British said that the Russians are going to do. So the Russians they've massed about 130,000 troops around the Ukrainian frontier, an awful lot of tanks, field hospitals, everything they would need for a full-scale invasion. They've never done anything on remotely approaching this scale since 1979, when they invaded Afghanistan. Now, okay, no, that was the Soviet Union, not just Russia, obviously. So it's very troubling. So how is it going to end? Now, Russia says, we've already pulled back some troops on the frontier. Now, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, says he's yet to see any evidence of that. That may well be a lie. Even if they have withdrawn some, it might be a tiny number out of 130,000. So it's all very worrying. You can see why countries would want to join NATO now. Russia might ask itself, since the fall of the Soviet Union, why has it lost so many allies? And why has the West gained so many allies? What's more attractive about Western democracy? 14 sovereign states have joined NATO, whereas Russia, of those 15 former Soviet republics, only 5 of them are military allies of NATO. Some former Soviet republics, well, 3 of them are now NATO member states. Ukraine and Georgia are chomping at the bit, desperate to join, because they face this unprovoked aggression from Russia. That's why, if Russia was a good neighbour, this wouldn't be happening. And it's also terribly sad, so avoidable, so utterly unnecessary. Anyway, Ukraine has the right to determine its own policies, its own language policy, to downgrade the Russian language. Might be better if they didn't, but that's up to them. And no, they're not fascists for doing that. Putin's the one who's really fascistic. Because of the Second World War, they're always banging on about that one. And yes, it was a triumph for Russia, and indeed Ukraine, and all Soviet republics who'd fought in that. Russia's only 50% of the population of the Soviet Union, and under 50% of ethnic Russians were. Of the Soviet Union, under 50% were ethnically Russian, about 40% were ethnically Russian. So they all share that in that glory. And then banging on about fascists, and it doesn't occur to some Russians that their own government could be genuinely fascistic, certainly totalitarian. So do I think is America's poking the bear? No, I think they are being friendly towards a struggling, fledgling democracy. If we let Russia get away with this, who's next? The whole of Georgia? Other sovereign states? Possibly Azerbaijan? They're testing the resolve of NATO. So what they'll do is they'll go into your airspace a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, and and their ships and so on, and more cyber attacks and more electoral interference and more disinformation. And can they actually send troops over the line, one toe cap over your border, and go further and further and further? At what point are you going to respond? And when you do respond, they say, no, lies, we never did anything. No, we were nowhere near your land. So no matter how irrefragable the evidence, they will lie and lie and lie shamelessly. And Putin has the advantage of not being held to account by the media, of not having real elections, because although there's more than one political party in Russia, they're all shades of the same colour. There's no real choice allowed between them. So it's all very dispiriting and very worrying, and I'm very glad to be at peace and far away from it. I know there is another line of reasoning. I come from Ireland, the British Isles were quite far from Ukraine. Should we care? Just shrug it off, just stay out of it, maybe. The thing is, will Sweden want to join NATO now? Feel sufficiently menaced by Russia because they're in the Baltic Sea with Russia? How about Finland? But remember, Finlandization has been an option offered to Ukraine. In 1944, the Finns pulled out of the Second World War and had a deal with the Soviet Union to have a very small army and never to join a military alliance and not in NATO. Would Finland break that now and join NATO? Would Russia see that as casus belli? Possibly. Trouble is, they'd be so distracted with Ukraine, maybe they could do nothing about it. I'm not sure they'd be allowed in, because I think you need all NATO members to approve. Turkey's got a fairly cordial relationship with Russia, might veto Finnish membership out of friendship with Russia. I don't know that Finland actually wants to join, but you can see why they'd be very nervous, because they could be taken over very easily, even though an EU member state. That's enough from me. So I wish we could live in peace, and it's really almost entirely Putin's fault, that of his irredentist, ultranationalist, militarist friends. If he backs down now, he might think he looks very foolish, and he's already done a lot of damage to his economy by the tensions he's raised. A détente wouldn't do that much to improve this. Then people start talking about coronavirus, his failings in other areas, the income compression, inflation, all the other areas was he's failing, and he's squandered so much money on the military and on utterly unnecessary wars. And obviously Western countries sometimes make the same mistakes. So that's enough from me. Thank you so much for following my channel. Toodaloo.